Hi, everyone. Welcome to Up Your Confidence podcast. I'm so excited today for another exciting conversation with our guest. Today, I'm excited to have Nicole Ward. She is a licensed therapist and also a licensed attorney. She has a lot of title behind her name that I'm not even gonna attempt to share here, but I'm definitely gonna make sure that you guys get to learn more about her. Today, our topic is going to be about healing trauma for Black women in corporate America. So let me go ahead and introduce Nicole. So Nicole Ward Rain, JDMA is a licensed marriage and family therapist. For her, she feel like you are the center of every relationship in your life. It's important to continue to grow into your best version of self on a continuous basis. Nicole is a disruptor of mental health myth, champion of wellness, and igniter of coping skill. Her professional title is a licensed marriage and family therapist, as I mentioned. Nicole believes that mental health is a natural and important part of our overall wellness regimen. In addition to her licensure as a therapist, she is also a licensed attorney. So it's like double whammy. I'm so excited about that because I really have a lot of questions. She currently owns a private practice specializing in adult mental health, relationship in all phase and stage, and wellness. Nicole is also a podcaster of Be Love, Be Well, and Be Whole. She's a co-host with her fellow podcaster, Dr. Tara, I believe. All right. Thank you, Nicole. I'm so excited to have you here. Welcome to the Up Your Confidence podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you, Lizette. I'm doing really well in the moment. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is a topic that has been very timely and has come up in a lot of spaces that I've been in. So I'm happy to be here with you.
I love it. One of the things that I like to talk about is always how I meet people, and how I bring guests on the show because I want the listener to understand, how I even curate the folks that come to the show. And I was introduced to you, via your lovely husband, our coach on the
Yes.
Black Agilis team that we have, and we network together. And he offered to bring you on, which was such a lovely gesture to talk about, he probably feel like we all needed healing racism. So we had like a lovely session. And I have to tell you, in my whole adult life, I've been in corporate America for 17 years, and I've been living in America for 23 years. I've never had any conversation about healing racism, so that 1 hour with you was so refreshing. And I remember I was
Oh,
probably eyeing you and say, I want you to be on the show. Because I was like, I'm that kind of person. I like to share when I hear something with the world, and this platform of Up Your Confidence allow me to do that. So as soon as it was humanly available, I brought Nicole here. So, but I wanted the conversation to be around, the trauma, because I do know there's a trauma and we can dive it into it. But can we learn a little bit about you? Because it's also important to understand why you do what you do, right? So I read, because I do my research, I read that you are a licensed attorney. So how do you move from, and I just love your background because it's everything that I love that I could have done in my life that I've never do. I like psychology and I love being an attorney, but I'm not good at any of those. I'm a science geek. I'm a mathematician, all that nerd. So I'm on this other side of the aisle. But how did you go? How did you get to be a lawyer, and what got you from being a lawyer into like becoming a therapist? Just so we learn a little bit about what you do.
sure. That's a great question, Lizette. And it's never too late. I mean, I tell people if you're interested in something and passionate about it, then there's ways to kind of do that. So you can still, delve into psychology and the law. But for me, I actually wanted to be a psychologist when I was in high school. I did a lot of peer counseling type training, and I just knew, like, okay, I'm going to be a psychologist. I applied to the psychology programs for the colleges that I applied to, ended up going to UCLA, was a psychology major there, but in that first quarter was just wondering how I was going to balance my personal and my professional life. And so it's very interesting now, at almost 46, to think about the thoughts I had at 18, which were, I don't know that I'm going to be able to balance listening to people on a professional scale and then listening to them in my personal life and giving advice. So I'm like, there's something else that I'm really interested in terms of a career, and it was being an attorney. And so I decided then that I was going to go to law school instead of going to grad school, but I was going to keep my major. And people asked me then, like, why aren't you switching your major to poli sci? And my response was, as an attorney, you work with people, you need to understand people, and be able to kind of have a background into what's going on for people, especially if you're doing jury selection, if you're interviewing people, all those skills are applicable. So I kept my psychology background, and that's what I was really passionate about. So from there, kept it, went to law school, and then graduated, passed the bar. And as I was going through that process, my last year of law school, my mother actually passed away. And she was very adamant for me and my brother to do what made us happy. Like, that is something that she just really stressed. And I remembered that's how I grew up. And I was happy enough, oddly enough, in law school, because a lot of people aren't happy there. But I knew that I wasn't going to practice law forever. I knew that. I knew that even once I started law school. And so I finished, passed the bar, started working for a bankruptcy trustee, which is a very niche type of opportunity. But when I was there, I was supposed to be reviewing like what was happening for people that were filing bankruptcy in terms of their financial plan. The only thing that I was supposed to do is find out what they could support as terms of payments, whether or not their attorneys were taking advantage of them, and can we move this case forward to the judge. That's all I was supposed to be doing. However, people came to me, and when we're conducting that part of the interview, they went into their stories. They were telling me why they were filing for bankruptcy, what had happened in their life. I learned about people's divorces, about their medical conditions, about their children being ill. And so for me, I was like, okay, I don't need any more of a shout. I need to go back to school and get my degree and become a therapist, because it's a calling. Law was a career and an amazing career, but this is my calling. I'm passionate about it. It wasn't going to let me leave it. I just took a different route to get back to it. So that's how it happened. And then now I've oddly enough married the two careers, in that I work for, or I contract with a company that places me with different law firms. So I'm actually working with some of the AmLaw 50 firms in terms of doing workplace wellness. And that is one of the things that, with the murder of George Floyd, my work went from just workplace wellness to not only just one aspect of it, but to whole person wellness. And that's what brought in racial identity, racial healing, being able to give voice to what people were experiencing, and looking at ways to cope and heal and grow in the face of like ongoing situations and trauma.
Right. Oh my God. I love it. I just love, because I did listen to your podcast, as I was telling you before we start. And then I realized that it was really a calling, and I love when people are doing things that they're super passionate about. And I just love your journey. So let's dive into it. So you have been in the corporate, right? You've been a lawyer, which is a really grueling work. I have couple of lawyer friends, and I know they don't sleep at night that much. So it's a very grueling environment, and being a Black woman in those spaces. I'm in the tech industry, and I know it's also very rare to see folks like us in those industries. So how do we deal with, because we know there's trauma, there's no question about it, right? So from a therapist perspective, especially with the work that you're doing recently since the May event, right, with the whole George Floyd situation, how are you helping folks really, I don't want to say overlook, but just experience what we're going through? How do we help each other in this moment right now?
Lizette, you touched upon one of the hallmarks of it is the helping each other. So being able to have a sense of community and collectiveness and having those spaces, that's something that's really important. The work that I do has, I mean, honestly, I kind of fell into it. I do have a background as a trauma clinician in intergenerational trauma, as far as like post-traumatic slave syndrome, which Dr. Joy DeGruy does a lot of work on. And I did a lot of workshops and trainings with understanding just that background. So that's kind of where that came from. But this was a whole nother element for me of being able to be called in to have sessions on a group level in terms of talking about racial healing. I've worked with individuals being able to do that as well. So this just kind of expanded what I was doing into the workplace even. But so it's just looking at for a sense of community when you're talking about how can we heal, because what we do know is that when you're continually being traumatized or experiencing trauma, healing is not necessarily always accessible. We can build resilience, and I know that that's something that we had a conversation about in that group, because resilience can actually only be built in during adversity, but it's looking at also ways to heal in form of radical healing while we still are undergoing traumatic circumstances, and just also acknowledging that and Brandon, that's my husband, and I were having a conversation about this earlier, knowing where you're at and recognizing that if you're not traumatized, it doesn't actually mean that there's something wrong with you, right? You can still be able to be proactive about protecting your mind, body, and spirit in these spaces as well.
Oh, I love that. Because I mean, I'm gonna back out and just because I know when you start talking, because I've been in session with you and I'm super clueless about all this, and even like the simple word of what is trauma? Can we just backtrack and talk about like,
Yes.
because you mentioned something about, how do you even know that you're traumatized? So can you just break it down to us? What is trauma, and what are the different phase of feeling that you experience in trauma?
Sure. So trauma is having a fear of bodily harm or and sometimes death. And the expanded version is also that it could be a mental or emotional type fear of where there's going to be some harm that you just cannot avoid. So that's a really nutshell layperson's definition of trauma. And knowing whether or not you're traumatized, that can be a little tricky. It's just being aware. One of the one things though that is common is this sense of numbness sometimes that develops where you're not necessarily feeling anything. You don't feel attached particularly to what you're doing. Maybe you're not feeling as attached to your home life or even your significant other or your work. So this kind of sense of floating through, that's one element that you might notice that perhaps you've experienced some trauma. Knowing that there was a triggering event, that's even from watching the different murders or killings, or even quite frankly hearing about all the numbers of COVID cases and COVID deaths, that can actually be traumatizing as well. And what that is even though you're not personally the one maybe experiencing the death of a loved one, or you weren't necessarily personally right there in filming or in front of what was going on, you still have this reaction that feels very visceral, and that has a name for it. That's called vicarious trauma. So it's just really knowing that um, it's okay to experience these things. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You're not broken. That's something that sometimes is said, is being able to know, okay, there's a way to kind of process this in a different way, so that even if you have experienced it, it's not going to sink you.
All right. I also read about the compassionate fatigue. I don't know if it's also part of, because the way you explain it, the floating, definitely, because this is how I feel that it happened. And you can educate me because I'm really here to learn, right? Things
Hmm.
happen to you, and we talking setting of corporate, and maybe somebody asks you some, I don't want to say dumb question, but in my mind it's not smart question, or somebody tried to make you feel very less because of something that you did at work. In that moment I don't feel the floating sense. I feel two things: either a shock that this is happening, or I don't even know that this is happening until maybe when I get home or on my way, I'm talking to another friend, and then the friend is having like a visceral reaction to what I just explained to them. That's when I know that, oh, this was a really bad thing that just happened to me. Or I talked to my husband and he's like, they should not have talked to you like that. So at that moment, I don't know, that's how my trauma show up. In the moment it doesn't show up to me. I don't know if this is normal, but can you explain a little bit, like, is this even a normal reaction to have? And what do you do when you find yourself in those kind of situation, like your coworker perhaps just jump into your to when we used to be in an office, right? And maybe start shouting and asking, like, I need this right now. And or you never do that, because it's always like the finger pointing, like you never do that. And as a black woman, you really want to do the real reaction that you would do in the street, but because we have been programmed to be professional, even though the other person was not professional, you keep it calm in the moment. And I'm wondering, even the fact that you're keeping calm create a trauma internally as well.
Oh, so Lizette, there's a couple of things in there. I'd love to unpack that, right? So you mentioned compassion fatigue, and that's something that is linked to within the trauma realm. But what that refers to, the easiest way to explain it is it's a frozen heart. It occurs a lot within the helping professions, where you've seen so much that you just feel like you have nothing left to give. And
Mm.
so, in some instances, things that might ordinarily be shocking don't feel shocking to you. And that's compassion fatigue. But when you asked, right, you shared your experience. You're like, oh, is that normal? I felt the shock. Shock is something that does occur when people may experience being traumatized. But the thing that I really want to pull out from you sharing is that trauma is experienced on a subjective level, meaning that every individual's experience is different. And so what might be traumatizing to one person might not be traumatizing to another. And I think it's really important to really pull that out, because how you're like, well, is that normal? Did I have even the right reaction? Like, what was going on for me? It was only after my friend said this. So it's just knowing that if when my clients say I was traumatized, I'm like, okay, that is what trauma is. And if they're like, well, I didn't really feel particularly shocked or afraid, I wasn't scared, but it's still something that was pretty bad that happened, they might not be traumatized. Still could be a negative experience, still could be something to process, but it might not be trauma, and that's okay. But for you, where you said there was a shock, right? And then it sounds like maybe even a freezing, which we know when our nervous system is activated, it's not just fight or flight that can happen, but it can be a freeze. And just knowing, right, that how you responded or reacted in the moment, that's what you needed to do, right? When you're looking back on it, or even sharing the story with a friend, the friend's outside of it. So they can see all the different pieces and be able to say, oh, I would have done this, right? Or how come you didn't do that? right? Or you might start thinking to yourself, well, how come I didn't respond this way? Why didn't I, yell or say, don't talk to me like that? Or just even not even yelling, how come it wasn't addressed in that moment? And it's just knowing what you're doing now is not giving yourself enough grace, right? You are looking at it from outside of the situation where you now have already lived through the situation. You have a different level of consciousness. You're trying to take that level of consciousness and throw it back into your body, right? And as lovely as humans are, we have not invented time travel yet. So we're not going to be able to do that, right? So it's being able to say, okay, I did the best that I could in that moment. Maybe you didn't like how you handle it. If the situation comes up again, this is what I'm going to do, right? Because sometimes it's recognizing what we need for ourselves, right? And that would be a tip, which is, what do you need in that moment for you, right? Not what does the other person need, but what do you need to do for you? And sometimes it is like, okay, I need to self-regulate. I'm not in a space where I want another person to be able to take my peace from me, right? So I'm going to protect my peace and being able to do that. But if it feels like, because you mentioned, okay, did I traumatize myself by not saying anything because I'm doing what I was told? Really unpacking that part too, right? Where it's just like, did I silence myself? Was I silencing my voice? Was I engaging in something that made me feel like I had to shrink myself or somehow dim my light? Did I need to appear safe to another person? Right. So those are different. That's a very different thing than you made a decision like, yeah, I don't feel like my peace being disturbed. So I'm just going to listen right now versus, oh, I need to make sure that I'm not threatening, right? I need to make sure that I, let that person still have their peace. That's very different.
So it seems like you need to have a sense of awareness, definitely,
Yes.
because a high sense of awareness, because it could go either way. Because at the beginning, I was thinking it could be that I'm just numb because I've been living through this experience so much that I'm in the moment. Maybe I'm just numb. And but does the
Right.
numbness mean that I'm traumatized? Also, that's another question that it does come into my mind, like, okay, maybe I'm numb to this situation and I don't, it's almost like being in a, I mean, we can talk about it, you a licensed therapist, it's almost like being in a, in a difficult relationship, right, with a partner that is
Right.
really violent with you, maybe verbally, hopefully not maybe verbally emotional with you, and maybe you're just numb to that. And you never react to it because you already block it from your head, like, okay, whenever my partner starts shouting or breaking stuff, I'm not going to react to it. But it doesn't mean it's a good thing. You might already be traumatized by that experience. So I try to translate that into like my experience or even other people's experience
Right.
that I know in the corporate world. Like, what should be our reaction? Is our reaction numbness because we have just been, are we silent because we've been numb to this, or what is the best course of action? I don't know if I'm clear with my question.
Well, the best course of action, Lizette, is doing what you're doing, unpacking it, right? Asking yourself the questions, not only being self-aware, but then as that awareness brings things to mind, acknowledging what it is that you're experiencing without what I share is without gaslighting yourself, right? Whereas it's like, oh, that didn't really happen. So just really being able to unpack it that way, because when I work with clients, should is a beautiful word in the English language, but when we apply it to ourselves, it does not help us. And with that being is that we say, oh, well, I should have done this or I should have done that. Should I be reacting a certain way, right, to when I experience these things? And my answer is no, right? You're going to react or respond based on where you're at in that moment in time. Now, the goal is to generate that awareness and acknowledgement so that you feel like you're able to be more responsive and less reactive during different situations. And you mentioned the numbness, really being able to unpack that too. Like, what does that mean? Numbness is something that for us is like a warning light. going off for people. Because it's one thing if people are like, oh, I'm feeling super sad, I'm feeling super angry. And I'm like, yes, you're feeling. But when that numbness comes in, it's like, okay, red light's blinking. What's going on? Let's figure out, like you just said, Lizette, you're doing this on your own, right? Where you're like, okay, what does that numbness mean? Is it like when someone's in abusive relationship? Because abusive relationships aren't just with romantic partners; they can happen in the workspace as well. And it's just knowing, and unfortunately, work the people bring their whole selves to work. And so if you've experienced maybe trauma, identified trauma in the past, be it maybe there was verbal abuse even with a parent in childhood, someone yelling at you in the workplace can be very triggering. So now it's not just about that moment in time, is bringing up all those other moments that you felt that way. And then that's where sometimes people have a reaction that they don't like, versus being a response. So it's asking yourself the questions, Lizette. That's how you do these things. There isn't one way you should be. It's how do you want to be? What would be your best version of self in that moment?
I love it when you say, how do you be your best version of yourself? So that bring up the next question, because does that mean you have to like literally, at least that's what I used to do when I was experimenting this thing, like I had to like literally pump myself, have like a whole routine for my, it's almost like going to war, have a pre-routine and
Mhm.
post-routine before I will go in the office. Like, okay, I know I'm going to these spaces, I need to gear myself and be ready mentally, and I will meditate before I go to office. In the middle of the day at lunch, I will meditate in my car. And then when I leave at night, I have another routine, because that's the only way I felt like I could survive, because it was getting to that point. So the response, I felt like that was my solution to myself. So what would be your solution to somebody, entering space that they feel triggered by a lot of things that happen throughout the day?
Being able, so we already talked about those two: self-awareness, being able to acknowledge what you're experiencing, engaging what you did. So if we want to put a name to it, it's called grounding. So grounding oneself, to yourself and then to your environment. So grounding to yourself came from you doing the meditation, right? Really just being able to connect in with yourself. Being able to ground to your environment would then be really act, it's a mindfulness exercise where you really just look at what it is in your environment. A simple thing to do, which I tell clients to do, is count the colors in the room. So this is going to bring you back to your environment. That's another good way to ground. And it's also being able to redefine and re-examine what it is that you're experiencing, right? So it's gonna be exhausting if it's like, okay, I'm going into this war zone. So one question you might ask yourself is, do I need to be going into this war zone? Another one is, do I want to go into this war zone? And if the answer is like, yeah, I want to, how do you reshape it so that it's not a war zone that you're going into, but that is a choice that you're making, where it's like, this is something that I actually enjoy, my workspace, right? And there's situations and circumstances that happen that I don't enjoy, but when you do a cost benefit, perhaps, or even a cost, which is, I need to stay at this job right now because I need to be employed. That's real for people as well. Whereas it's like, okay, how do I do this without it becoming my spirit, with it sinking into my mind and body, so that you cleanse yourself from it. So that meditation at the end of the day is something that would help as well. Or listening to music, that's something that is helpful. When I was a trauma clinician, I used to get in my car, take my badge off, put it in the armrest, and turn on music. Going into work, I would listen to a podcast, but after spending time listening to people's stories, when I wanted to go home, it was time to listen to the music. And that was my way of grounding myself. And my job was not a war zone. I enjoyed what I did. But I also knew the impact of walking through trauma with children and wanting to make sure that I was going to be my best version of self in the moment by taking care of myself and just having those little rituals of, okay, now I'm leaving the job. So I'm leaving this part, and then I'm going to be able to re-engage at home. So just doing those things. But I want to really touch on not feeling like you have to go to a war zone, because that gets exhausting, feeling like you have to be continually be prepared. So there's finding that rhythm of being prepared without it being, I have to now manage how everybody else feels. Because that's honestly, I'm going to say this, I don't say it very often, it's impossible. I'm a therapist. I don't manage how people feel. I don't manage how people think. I don't change those things either, which sometimes is shocking for people to hear from a therapist. I guide people. Ultimately, they are going to come up to what it is they need to do. So when we put ourselves in these work situations where it's like, oh, I have to change this person's mind, right? Or I have to, sometimes people are like, I have to make them think differently about my entire race or my entire culture. It's like, that's exhausting. What would happen if you're like, okay, I'm just going to prepare myself and I'm going to see where people are at when I go in. I'm going to either meet them there or not, but I'm going to do things to protect my peace. And it's just knowing that. And I've been in different spaces. When I was in law school, I was the only, not just Black woman, but Black person in my section of 80 students. And how we went to school is that that's who you were with the whole year. And I can't imagine how exhausted it would have been. Well, actually, I can't imagine if I had felt like I had to be prepared for whatever and put on this armor every time I walked in there, instead of it being, okay, I know that I'm going to be frustrated sometimes. I know that I'm going to be angry sometimes, depending on what comments might come up. And I'm going to make sure that if I have a reaction instead of a response, I'm going to do something to take care of myself. I'm going to go hang out with my friends. I'm going to go into the office, the BALSA office, the Black Student Law Student Association office is what we used to do, and just sit and be in community and have a sanity check. Like, do these things for myself so that I didn't feel like I had to take care of the others, or that I had to shrink myself so that I wouldn't get any comments. So I think that that's important too.
I agree, because what happened is when you, and I love the fact that you say don't take on the armor, because I definitely did that for a long time until maybe a couple of years ago, where I was exhausted. I think the exhaustion
Yeah.
and the trauma just make you learn better, and like, okay, I'm no longer want to be the one that, because you feel like, especially because we Black, we women, there's already a perception of how we should be, right? Or how we are. So as soon as you enter those spaces, it's almost like what my grandmother say, it's like, it's not just you, but it's everybody, so do not go out there and go misbehave, out there.
Yes.
Because I mean, even I'm an African woman, and even in Africa, my grandmother will say that don't go out there and messed up, because it's your last name, right? Everybody's gonna know so and so did so and so. So you take those little things with you, and I'm trying to raise my daughter to be free in her mind, not feel like she's taking on armor of her whole race or her whole family or her whole generation, and just be in the world, because it doesn't serve us. Because you enter those spaces, you feel like, almost like you feel like everybody is looking at you, all eyes on you, kind of thing, and it feels, not only it's the case, but it would be nice if it was not how people make you feel, because you have your own perception of how people make you feel. But then when the perception match actually the reality, because
Yeah.
when you make one mistake, and everybody it take it to 100, and when others that don't look like you make the mistake, and everybody is like, oh, that was just a simple mistake, then the perception become a reality. Then you see yourself in that
Right.
kind of situation. So I totally agree with you that it doesn't serve us. But what can we do for somebody, because you and I already have our career and we're learning from it, but somebody that is young, just graduate from college, and they want to enter corporate America, they're super excited and everything. Maybe they didn't go, they went to college, because I was just talking to somebody that went to like a HBCU, and so it was like all just people that look like them, and then boom, they get dropped into like corporate America is no longer. And I start asking myself after the conversation, like, is that even a good thing anymore? I don't know, because there's always going to be the shock, so I don't know which one is better. But how do we prepare young ladies, that are going to those jobs, starting in the fall or spring, to feel empowered, that they don't have to show up for everybody? I know it's a long question, but I hope it makes sense.
No, I totally understand that. And I think, Lizette, what you said is that I don't know that there is a better, right? Like we sometimes we look at things as a dichotomous thing, like, oh, it's better to, because I remember when I was applying to college, it's like, oh, well, you want to be prepared for the real world. And I'm like, okay, HBCUs are the real world as well, right?
Right.
And then I did go to UCLA, and it's not that going to UCLA then somehow fortified me for all sorts of challenges with my race or my gender that I was going to encounter. It really is just being able to have conversations with even older people, right? So, talking to older people who've gone through where you are. So, having like a mentor group, right? So having
Yes.
a mentor, being able to network, talking to not just even older, but maybe even some peers that are in similar positions and careers, to be able to just have that community around you. That's something that's really important as humans, and we really are seeing some of the impacts of us being so isolated with COVID. But being able to have some sort of community. When I talk to therapists about setting up their private practices in a solo capacity, which is what I am, you still have to have community. So for those young women, being able to prepare themselves, having community, and not feeling like, oh, I'm less than because I didn't go to an HBCU, right? So I didn't get to have that experience, or I'm less than because I did. There's not one that's better than, is how do you develop your community? So that would be number one. And number two is not shaming yourself. So if you feel like you need to put on armor to go to go into work, don't shame yourself. Even when I was like, don't do that. Don't. The bigger don't is not to shame yourself. If you do, if you feel like that's what you need to do, then you might need to do it for that moment. But I want you to ask, is that you being your best version of self in the moment? Because that armor does get heavy and exhausting when it's made out of pieces that others have put on us. So if you want to have something, have a shield. And that shield is based upon your ancestors. That shield is based upon all the love and support that has been poured into you. And you have a sword. And that sword is your knowledge. That sword is your confidence. That sword is just anything that you need to feel empowered, right? And those things aren't heavy. And you can be seen in that. We can't be seen in armor. So just knowing those things. So community, being prepared in a way that you are seen and help and your whole self. And then the last one that I would say is asking questions, right? Being curious. Listening to podcasts is a way to be curious. That's why I love what you do here, Lizette. And just knowing that confidence is not something that you either have or you don't have. It's something that can be built upon. It's something that you can tap into. Is something that you sometimes might need others to help remind you of those things. So just having those three things of community, just the self-awareness and of, that was the second one. And then this third one of just being curious and having questions is really important. And curious with yourself, right?
Yes.
That applies to us as well. So instead of telling ourselves, oh, you didn't perform the way that you needed to when you went into that office or when you went into that interview, you don't have to be that critical with yourself. It's like, okay, what could I have done better?
Yeah.
I'm still
I
holding
love
myself
it.
accountable.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love it. Give yourself grace, pretty much, and that is, I love the fact that you mentioned community, because especially with this whole isolation of COVID, community has been really important, because then you realize that,
Yeah.
we don't have to see each other, but there's feeling having just community, because personally I'm going through stuff, but I have like a bunch of different community that I can just plug in with, and people texting me. It just make me feel like I'm not alone, even though I might feel alone in
Right.
my present space, but I'm not alone, in general. So that's crucial. So that advice will go for all of us. It's not just, and being curious also, I love that takes you a long way, and so I'm so grateful for all your answer, and we coming toward the end of this lovely conversation. I don't want it to end because it's so soothing. All your answer has been really soothing. As I mentioned to you, I love listening to you, because I'm like, oh, this is like how you, when you talk to a therapist, she calm you down, because I am not somebody that is calm by nature. So that's why I have to like meditate in the morning and then at night. But I want to know, what do you do for self-care? For as a therapist, I think you kind of like allude to it a little bit, but what do you do for self-care, or also what do you do to up your confidence every day and get yourself moving, and you already mentioned that confidence is something that you have to build up. So how do you build it? If you want to touch on that as the last part here.
Sure. So, I mean, for me, therapists, we're humans and we're not always great at always doing self care all the time. That's a myth about us. Um, However, what I meditate in the morning. One is a body scan, and the other one is just a silent. I actually like silence. Is a silent meditation, and they're really quick, right? Because a lot of times people tell me they don't have time for self care, but if even if you have those 3 minutes, my body scan is 3 minutes, and then the silent meditation is five. So that's a total of 8 minutes each morning of how I start out. And then I have the Calm app on my phone, and it gives me a reminder every day at 1:30 to sit and to do something mindful. However, I might not do it every day at 1:30, but I think it's important that you also keep that reminder there so that you will eventually get to it. I try to get outside. That's one of the things, even with it being cold in here in Virginia. And I'm a California girl, so being here with snow. But I bundled up and I took a little walk outside. Even if you step outside for a little bit, that's really important. Walking, playing video games. Those are
Oh,
some of
nice.
the other things that I do. And then in terms of confidence, it's just really having, you can have a mantra, you can have a playlist. I love music, and those are my recommendations for playlists all the time. Dr. Dina and I, who I do the podcast with, one of our check-ins is what's your theme song for the day. So having a confidence playlist, right? These are the songs that get you going. These are the songs that pour into you, and that when you hear them, you actually feel like, yes, I can take this on. That would be a recommendation. Checking in with your friends. I just had tea a couple, actually it was on last Saturday, and I let them know that I was doing this podcast, and I asked my friends, I was like, what are some things you guys do? And one of my best friends said she has positivity confessions, and I was like, wow, I really like that term, right? So
That
it's a
too.
confession of all the positive things that are going right? And just knowing that. And then others were kind of like checking in, having the community, being able to even send a text message like, hey, I'm down today, and then having someone even send you an emoji, to be honest with you.
Yes.
So having those accountability buddies when you aren't feeling so confident, because the difference between a confident person and non-confident, in my opinion, is that with confidence you recognize, okay, it's ebbing and flowing, and I'm going to do what I need to do to build it and to tap back into it and to engage it, versus succumbing to, well, I'm just not confident and I never will be.
Right.
We all have insecurities. It really is up to us how we manage them.
I love it. I love it. I love the whole confidence playlist. I need to like go find my own confidence playlist. I was like, do I have one? I love music, but I don't use it as much as I can because I don't like to listen
Hmm.
to music in my house. I like quietness. But I listen to
Hmm.
music super, super loud and I only listening to it
Ah,
in the car. So now that COVID has happened and we're not driving anymore, I haven't been listening to that much music except what my daughter do listen to, on her Alexa often in the other room. So yeah, I need to I love that. Everything that you said, that's the one that I grow. And everybody, I love asking this question to my guests because everybody tell you something different, and you like you always
yes,
I love the positivity one. I'm like, okay, that's not a gratitude. Because one of the episodes before this was about the power of writing, journaling. I'm like, okay, that's a different thing, do a positivity confession. I love it. Thank you so much.
yeah.
How can we follow you? I know you have your podcast. Give us information about your podcast, your website. How can we follow you on your social media so that people can not only follow you, but reach out because I'm definitely know that this conversation has been really enlightening and folks we need more information and perhaps even reach out for session with you. So more information, please.
Sure. Thanks, Lizette. So, all the social media is really simple. It's Nicole LMFT 12. Those are my handles for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then the podcast is Be Love, Be Well, Be Whole. And we are on all the platforms where people listen to their podcast. And we also have our the theme songs that we come up with for our mood check-ins for each episode. I just created a playlist on Spotify, so that's available as
Oh,
well, and that's
cool.
under Be Love, Be Well, Be Whole Mood on Spotify. That's the playlist. And then my website is www.NicoleMWard.LMFT.com. And that will shift eventually, but right now that's where we're at. But I will be transitioning my, I guess I can say it even here, that Soul Compass Therapy and Consulting will be the new name for my business. But right now,
Oh,
you can still
cool.
find me under Nicole Ward. Mhm.
Awesome, awesome. Oh, that's a lot of you so busy. You got a lot going on. The whole you have a lot going on. And I know like these are really busy times, so I can imagine how busy you probably are. So thank you very much. This was awesome. I
Thank you,
really
Lizette.
enjoy our conversation and I'm sure we're gonna come back or we're gonna find ourselves again talking one of these days. And I'm already subscribed to your podcast, so because I need that kind of energy in my life. The whole vibe, I love it. Check-in, the mood
Oh,
check-in, I love it. So I'm definitely a subscriber. So thank you so much, and this was a pleasure.
thank you, Lizette.
Thank you. Bye.